21. Benny Amato said, "Little Carmine? I've known him since he was a kid." He was talking to Joey Daniello, one of Frank Nitty's boys. It was 9 in the morning, and they'd just gotten off the train from Chicago. They were walking along the platform, each carrying a suitcase, behind a dozen or so citizens all heading toward Grand Central's main concourse. "You sure you're not going to recognize him?" Joey asked. He had asked Benny the same question a dozen times already. He was a skinny guy, looked like a bag of bones. He and Benny were both dressed like working stiffs in khaki slacks and cheap shirts under frayed windbreakers. Both had on knit caps pulled down low on their foreheads. "Sure, I'll recognize him. Didn't I say I knew him since he was a kid?" Benny pulled off his cap, ran his fingers through his hair, and then yanked the cap back into place. He was also thin but wiry and strong, with knots of muscles in his arms that showed through his shirt sleeves. Joey, on the other hand, looked like he'd shatter into a million pieces if someone punched him hard enough. "Anybody ever tell you worry a lot, Joey?" Benny asked. He said it good-naturedly, but Joey didn't laugh. "The two Anthonys should have worried like me," Joey said. "Those Cleveland guys? They're all amateurs over there, Jesus," Benny said. "It's fucking Cleveland." In front of the two men, an archway led out onto the cavernous main concourse of Grand Central, where wide beams of sunlight spilled down from immense windows and splashed onto the floor. Scores of travelers moved toward ticket windows or the information booth or the street, but in the massiveness of the space, they all looked lost. In the center of a shaft of sunlight towards the middle of the concourse, a pair of stout women with wash buckets and mops went about sloshing soapy water over the floor where a little girl had vomited. A young woman held the child in her arms while the women mopped, a cloying, minty smell rising up from their washing as Joey and Benny walked past. "You got any kids?" Benny asked. "Kids are nothing but trouble," Joey said. "Huh," Benny said. "I like 'em." And he continued beside Joey, heading for the 42nd Street exit as bits and pieces of conversation bounced off walls and floated up toward the constellations in an impossibly high ceiling. "I got nothing against kids," Joey said. "All it is they're trouble is all." He scratched the back of his neck as if something had just bitten him there. "He's meeting us right outside, right? You sure you can still recognize him?" "Yeah," Benny said. "Known him since he was little." "He's one of Mariposa's boys?" "I gotta tell you," Joey said. "I don't like it this guy's gotta call us in all the way from Chicago to take care of his business for him. Fucking Sicilians, bunch of farmers." "You tell Nitty that?" "What, that Sicilians are a bunch of farmers?" "No, that you don't like it we're coming from Chicago to take care of New York business." "No," Joey said. "Did you tell Al?" "Al's currently unavailable." "This shouldn't be no trouble," Benny said. "From what I hear, this Corleone is all talk, no muscle." "That's probably what the Anthonys heard, too," Joey said, and he attacked the back of his neck again, scratching like he was trying to kill something. Outside Grand Central, on the sidewalk in front of the 42nd Street exit, Carmine Loviero tossed a cigarette to the ground and stubbed it out with his toe. "Over here," he called to Benny. "Hey!" Benny was halfway into the motion of lifting his right arm to check his wristwatch when he froze at the sound of Carmine calling him. He looked over to the bulky figure in a pale blue suit and observed him with obvious confusion before crossing the sidewalk. "Little Carmine," he said finally. He put his suitcase down and embraced him. "Madre Dio, I didn't recognize you. You must have put on 20 pounds. "More like 40 since the last time I saw you," Carmine said. "Jesus, what was I, 15 years old?" "Yeah, probably. Gotta be 10 years. Benny looked over Carmine's shoulder at the guy standing on the curb behind and to the left of him. "Who's this?" he asked. "This is my buddy Jojo," Carmine said. "Jojo DiGiorgio. You guys never met?" "Nah," Jojo said. "Never had the pleasure." He offered Benny his hand. Joey Daniello had hung back from the meeting and was watching the three men from beside the entrance to Grand Central. As he leaned against the terminal's outer wall, his foot resting on his suitcase, his right hand in his pocket, He massaged his forehead with his free hand. He looked like a man suffering from a headache. Benny shook hands with Jojo and then turned and waved for Joey to join them. "Joey the Jip," he said under his breath to Carmine. "He don't look like much, but Maron, don't get him mad. He's a lunatic." When Joey joined them, his hand still in his pocket, Benny said, "This is little Carmine I was telling you about, and this here," he said, "is Jojo DiGiorgio." Joey nodded to both men. "So is this a reunion?" he asked. "Or do we have business needs taken care of?" "Business," Jojo said. To Carmine, he said, "Get their suitcases, why don't you?" Carmine looked to Jojo as if he wasn't sure what was being asked of him. Joey Daniello said to Benny, "Hey, where's your good pal, little Carmine? Looks like he got lost." Benny, who was sweating, asked Luca in a shaky voice if he could get a handkerchief out of his pocket to wipe his brow, and Luca nodded. Joey was grinning. He looked like he was enjoying himself. "Hey, Jojo," he said, and he leaned closer to the front seat. "How much you guys pay Benny's good friend, little Carmine, to set us up? I'm curious." "We didn't pay him nothing," Jojo said. He took his hat off and dropped it over the guns on the seat between him and Vinny. "We convinced him it'd be good for his health to do what we told him." "Oh," Joey said, and he leaned back in his seat again, his eyes on Luca. To Benny, he said, "Hey, at least your pal didn't sell you out. That's something." Benny's face was pale, and he appeared to be having trouble breathing. "Relax," Luca said to him. "We're not gonna kill anybody." Joey Daniello laughed. It was a bitter little laugh that didn't interrupt the stare he had fixed on Luca. "Carmine's on his way back to Jumpin' Joe right now," Vinny said, looking into the rear view. "Maybe they'll send the cavalry for you." Joey pointed a finger at Luca. "You know who you look like?" "Really?" he said. "You look like that fucking Frankenstein that Boris Karloff plays in the movie. Did you see that?" He touched his eyebrows. "The way your forehead's like that," he said. "Like an ape, you know?" When Luca didn't answer, he added, "What happened to your face? You have a stroke or something? My grandmother looked like that after she had a stroke." Jojo pointed his gun at Daniello. To Luca, he said, "You want me to put a bullet in his face right here, boss?" "Put it away," Luca said. "He don't want you to shoot me in the car," Joey said. "Why make a mess?" Looking at Luca again, he said, "Probably got a nice place all picked out for us." "Relax," Luca said to Daniello. "I said we're not gonna kill anybody." Joey laughed the same bitter laugh. He shook his head as if disgusted by Luca lying to him. He looked out his window. "All these people on the street," he said, sounding like he was talking to himself. "They all got things to do. They're all going someplace." Jojo glanced at Luca, his face screwed up like Daniello might be a little crazy. Benny said, "If you're not killing us, what are you doing?" Jojo looked to Luca again before he answered. "You're bringing a message back to Capone in the Chicago outfit, that's all. We're sending out messages today, like Western Union. Little Carmine's bringing a message to Mariposa, and you're bringing a message back to the outfit." "Oh, yeah?" Joey said, grinning. "Well, give us the message and you can let us out at the corner. We'll grab a cab." When no one answered, he said, "Yeah, a message." On the corner of West Houston and Mercer, Vinny parked in a dirt alley between a line of warehouses and factories. It was a sunny morning, and there were men on the street behind them in lightweight jackets and women in summery dresses. A vein of sunlight penetrated a few feet into the alley and washed over a grimy brick wall. Beyond that, it was all shadow. There was no one moving, but a dirt path on the ground had been beaten into dust with foot traffic. "So we're here," Daniello said, as if he recognized the place. Luca pulled Benny out of the car, and then they all followed the shadowy alley until it ran into a second, wider alley that crossed the first like a T, where a line of shacks was propped up against a windowless brick wall. The shacks were made of cobbled-together scrap wood and junk, and they had stovepipes sticking out of their roofs. A cat lay on the ground outside the tarp doorway of one shack beside a baby carriage and a soot-blackened metal garbage barrel with a cooking grate over the top of it. The alley was deserted at this time of the morning, when everyone was out looking for work. "It's here," Vinny said, and he led the group to a locked door between two of the shacks. He pulled a key from his pocket, struggled with the lock a minute, and then put his shoulder into the door and opened it onto the dank, empty space of what must have once been a factory, but was now an echoey shell where pigeons roosted on high windows and spattered the floor with their droppings. The place smelled of mold and dust, and Benny covered his nose with his cap before Vinny pushed him along toward a rectangular opening in the floor, where a single length of pipe remained from what was once a railing. "This way," Vinny said, pointing down the opening to a rickety flight of stairs that disappeared into darkness. "I can't even see nothing down there," Benny said. "Here," Jojo said. He moved in front of Benny and started down the stairs with a silvery cigarette lighter held out in front of him. At the bottom of the steps, where it was too dark to see, he flipped open the lighter, and the red glow of the flame illuminated a flickering red corridor. Every few feet along the hallway, there were openings into small rooms with dirt floors and bare brick walls. The walls were damp and clammy, and water dripped from a low ceiling. "This is perfect," Danielo said. "It's the fucking catacombs down here." "The what?" Vinny said. "It's this one." Jojo led the others into one of the spaces. "Yeah? What makes this one special?" Danielo asked. "This," Jojo said, and he lowered his cigarette lighter and placed it on an upright brick next to a coil of rope and a roll of black plastic. Then Luca buttoned up his trench coat and turned up the collar. He motioned for Vinny and Jojo to step back in the doorway. He swung the machete brutally and hacked off Benny's feet, high above the ankles. Blood splashed across the room and poured out onto the floor. Luca stood back to look over his work, and when Benny's yelps and screams seemed to annoy him, he pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and jammed it down the kid's throat. "So, what?" Joey said calmly once Benny's screams were muffled. "You really not gonna kill us? You're just crippling us? That's your message?" "No," Luca answered. "I'm gonna kill Benny. I don't like him." He swung the machete again and sliced off Benny's hands at the wrists. When the kid's body hit the ground and he tried to crawl away on his stumps, Luca stepped on his calf and pinned him to the floor. "Looks like you'll have to deliver our message to the outfit," he said to Joey. Under his foot, the kid spit out the handkerchief and screamed for help, as if there were a chance someone would hear him in the basement of an abandoned factory behind a deserted alley, as if it were possible that someone would come to his rescue. Luca leaned over the kid and, with both hands on the hilt, thrust the machete through his back and heart. When he pulled the blade out, there was blood everywhere, on the walls and the dirt floor, all over Luca's trench coat, and on Joey Danielo still hanging from the wall, on his clothes and on his face. Luca kicked the kid's body to a corner and then reached into his pocket and pulled out a clean white slip of paper. His bloody hands quickly threatened to render the handwritten note unreadable. He passed it to Jojo. "Read this to Mr. Danielo," he said. "This is the message you're to deliver," he said to Joey. "It's from Don Corleone, and it's intended for your bosses in Chicago and for Capone in Atlanta." He nodded to Jojo. Jojo carried the note across the room and bent down close to the flame of the cigarette lighter. "Dear Mr. Capone," Jojo said, reading from the note. "Now you know how I deal with my enemies." He coughed, clearing his throat. Why does a Neapolitan interfere in a quarrel between two Sicilians? He continued, taking his time with each word. If you wish me to consider you as a friend, I owe you a service which I will pay on demand. He pulled the paper close to his face, trying to read through a blood smear. A man like yourself, he continued, must know how much more profitable it is to have a friend who, instead of calling on you for help, takes care of his own affairs and stands ever ready to aid you in some future time of trouble. He paused and tried to wipe away another blood smear over the last sentence. If you do not want my friendship, he read, so be it. But then I must tell you that the climate in this city is damp, unhealthy for Neapolitans, and you were advised never to visit. When he was finished, he stood and handed the note back to Luca, who folded it and slipped it into Joey Daniello's jacket pocket. That's it, Joey said. Just deliver this note? Can I trust you to deliver it? Luca asked. Sure, Daniello said. I can deliver your message for you. Sure I can. Good, Luca said. He picked up the machete and started for the door. You know what? He said, pausing in the doorway. You know what? He repeated, approaching Joey. I'm not so sure I can trust you. 22. One of Tony Rosato's men leaned over a sink full of sudsy water in the 25th Street apartment and scrubbed his shirt on a washboard. He was a short, squat kid in his 20s, wearing a sleeveless white undershirt and wrinkled dress pants, his thick head of hair a rumpled mop. Giuseppe had been up for an hour already. From the look of the sunlight through the kitchen windows, it was after 10 in the morning. The kid was intent on dragging his shirt over a washboard, a sheet of opaque corrugated glass in a wood frame, splashing suds over the side of the porcelain sink and onto the linoleum. Giuseppe glanced up and down the hallway outside the kitchen and saw no one moving. After 10 o'clock, and every one of the idiots working for him was still sleeping, except this idiota, washing his shirt in the kitchen sink. Giuseppe looked at the front page of the New York Times, which he had just picked up a moment earlier outside the front door, where he'd found both of Tomasino's guards asleep in their chairs. He picked up the newspaper, closed the door, and come back down the hall to the kitchen, and he hadn't roused anyone's attention, not even this moron washing his shirt in the sink. What balls! Washing his shirt in the kitchen where everybody else eats. Albert Einstein was on the front page of the Times, looking like some chooch in a good suit, with a wing collar and a silk tie, and he couldn't comb his fucking hair. Hey, stupido, Giuseppe said. The kid at the sink jumped, splashing water onto the floor. Don Mariposa. He looked at Giuseppe, saw his expression, and held up his shirt. I spilled wine all over my good shirt, he said. The boys was all up late last night playing Mezzofinuk, Giuseppe said. I catch you again washing your clothes with the rest of us eat, I'll put a bullet in your ass, okay? Sure, the kid said, like the idiota he was. He reached into the soapy water and pulled out a rubber stopper. It won't happen again, Don Mariposa, he said, the water draining fast out of the sink, a whirlpool parting the suds. I'm going up on the roof. Get Emilio and tell him I want to see him, and tell him to bring Tits with him. Sure, the kid said. Then get this place cleaned up, put on some coffee, and get everybody else out of bed. You think you can handle all that? Sure, the kid said, and he leaned against the sink, soaking the back of his pants. Giuseppe glared at the kid and then went back to the master bedroom, where the sheets and covers to his bed were bunched up at the footboard. He tossed and thrashed most nights, fighting with his bedding. He groaned, too, sometimes loud enough that he could be heard in the next apartment. On the other side of the open bathroom door, a mirror over the sink was still fogged with steam from the shower. He always took a shower as soon as he got out of bed. Unlike that Strons, his father, long dead and good riddance, or his mother, the two of them a pair of worthless drunks, them and their beloved fucking Sicily, They stunk to high heaven half the time. Giuseppe got up, got showered, got dressed first thing always, ever since he was a young man. Always wore a suit. Even when he didn't have 2 nickels to rub together, he found a way to get hold of a decent suit. Out of bed, dressed, and at his business. That's why he was where he was, and the rest of these nobodies were working for him. He looked over the bedroom at all the furnishings, the mahogany sleigh bed and the night tables, and the matching dresser and mirror, everything brand new. He liked the place and thought maybe he'd keep it for one of his girls after all this bullshit with Corleone was over. His jacket was hanging on the back of the bathroom door, and under it, his shoulder holster. He put the jacket on and left the holster. He opened the dresser drawer and chose a tiny derringer from a clutter of pistols. He put the gun in his jacket pocket and went up to the roof, smacking each of the sleeping guards on the head as he passed them, waking them and walking away without a word. It was gorgeous on the roof, the sun heating up the tar paper, warming the stone cornice. He guessed the temperature was in the 70s, a sunny spring morning, almost summery. Giuseppe liked being outside in the fresh air. It made him feel clean. He went to the edge of the roof, put a hand on the back of a gargoyle's head, and looked out over the city, which was already bustling with people and traffic rushing along the avenues. Nearby, the white arrow of the Flatiron Building gleamed in the sunlight. When he was still coming up, he worked a while for Bill Dwyer in Chicago. That was where he met Capone. Whenever Bill asked him to do something, didn't he jump to it? He did. He jumped, and then they started calling him Jumpin' Joe, which he made a big deal of not liking, but he didn't mind it. Goddamn right he jumped. He jumped all his life. Something needed doing, he jumped to it. That's why he rose up the way he did. When the roof door opened behind him, he took a seat on the stone cornice, resting his arm on the gargoyle, and motioned for Emilio to sit alongside him. "Tell me again," he said. "We're absolutely certain it was Frankie Pentangeli's boys?" "Yeah," Emilio said. He sat alongside Giuseppe and tapped a cigarette out of his pack. "Carmine Rosato was there. He says it was Fausto and Fat Larry and a couple of boys he didn't know. They shot up the place. We're out 10 grand easy. And the union offices." Giuseppe motioned for Emilio to give him a cigarette. "Had to be Frankie. We got a war now, Joe. Frankie's with the Corleones." Giuseppe took the cigarette Emilio offered and tapped it against the stone cornice. Emilio handed him a lighter. "And us?" Giuseppe said. "We still pulling our puds?" "They've moved or shut down their banks and most of their gambling places, so they're losing money. That's one thing. The guys," Emilio said, "all their big guys are out at that place on Long Island. It's like a fortress out there. You gotta risk your life just to get a peek. To get inside, you'd have to lay siege to the place, like in medieval times." "What times?" Giuseppe asked. He handed the lighter back to Emilio. "Castle times," Emilio said. "Like castles and moats and such." "Ah," Giuseppe said, and then he was quiet as he looked up at a blue cloudless sky. "So now we know for sure," he said, not looking at Emilio. "It was Frankie tipped them off about the Anthonys." He turned a grim face to Emilio. "See, I never trusted Frankie," he said. "He didn't like me. He smiled, he said the right things, but I could tell. He never liked me. Only thing I'm sorry is I didn't just put a bullet in him like I should have." He stubbed out his cigarette and tossed it off the roof. "You stood up for him, Emilio. You said hold on, don't rub him out. Wait and see, he's a good guy." "Hey, Joe," Emilio said. "How could I have known?" Joe tapped a finger against his heart. "Instinct," he said. "I didn't know, but I suspected. I should have gone with my gut and killed him." When the roof door opened and Ettore Barzini came out of the shadowy doorway with Tits following, Giuseppe said to Emilio, slipping in a final word before the others joined them, "This thing with the Irish better work, Emilio. Do you hear me?" "Yeah, sure," Emilio said. "I hear you, Joe." Giuseppe and Emilio stood up as Ettore and Tits approached. Emilio and I were just talking about that scumbag traitor Frankie Pentangeli, Giuseppe said. Son of a bitch, Ettore said. He was wearing a smoky gray suit with a black shirt and no tie, the collar open. I can hardly believe it, Joe. But the thing is, Giuseppe said, looking at Tits, the thing that's got me confused is, we didn't tell Frankie about the Anthonys. And Frankie didn't know about Capone's men, so how do you find out? He took a drag on his cigarette and exhaled, his eyes on Tits. How'd he know about Angelo's? How'd he know about the guys the outfit sent over? Somebody had to tip him off. Tits, he said. You got any ideas? Don Mariposa, Tits said. The kid's face, his plump cheeks and ready smile that made him look childish, turned uncharacteristically hard, almost angry. How could I tip off Frankie? He said. I'm not one of his guys. I have no dealings with him at all. When would I even see him to tip him off? Please, Don Mariposa, I had nothing to do with this. Joe, Ettore said, I'll vouch for Tits. Why would he tip off Frankie? What's in it for him? Shut up, Ettore, Joe said, looking at Emilio. Do you vouch for him too? He asked Emilio. Sure I do, Emilio said. The kid's been with me since he was a boy. He wouldn't turn on me. It's not him, Joe. Of course he wouldn't turn on you. You're like a father to him. He ain't gonna turn on you. Giuseppe shook his head, disgusted with the whole question. He motioned for the others to follow him as he started toward the roof door. You know how this makes me look to the other families now? To my friend Al Capone? To the outfit? Do you know how this makes me look? Tits bolted in front of the others to open the roof door for Giuseppe. Giuseppe said to Tits, You don't like me much, do you? Tits said, I like you fine, Don Mariposa. Don Mariposa, Don Mariposa, Giuseppe said to Emilio as he stepped into the shadows of a foyer-like space above a flight of steps. Now, all of a sudden, your boy's full of respect. Tits pulled the door closed behind him, and the four men stood in a small circle at the head of the stairs. Giuseppe shook his head again, as if responding to an argument that the others couldn't hear. You know what? He said to Tits. I don't know if you tipped off Frankie or the Corleones or what the fuck. But other than my captains, you're the only one who knew all the details, so... That's not true, Don, the kid shouted. We all know everything. I don't keep things from my men, Emilio said, stepping a little closer to Giuseppe. I gotta trust them, and they all knew Frankie was cut out. None of my men said squat to him. 23. Cork pulled the bakery's green window shade halfway down against the blaze of morning sunlight coming in off the street. Eileen had just delivered a steaming tray of sweet sticky buns, and the shop smelled of cinnamon and fresh-baked bread. The early morning rush of customers had already come and gone, and now Eileen had disappeared upstairs with Caitlin and left him to straighten out the display cases and get the shop in order. Cork didn't mind working in the bakery. He was getting to like it, though he could do without the white apron and cap Eileen made him wear. He liked chatting with the customers, who were almost exclusively women. He enjoyed telling stories with the married women and flirting with the unmarried ones. Eileen swore that business had picked up the day after he'd started working the counter. As soon as the shade was set, a long black dress appeared in the bottom of the window, and a moment later the bell rang over the door as Mrs. O'Rourke came into the shop toting a brown paper bag. She was a narrow wisp of a woman with graying hair and a scrunched-up face that looked like it was wincing even when at ease. "Ah, Mrs. O'Rourke," Cork said, a note of sympathy in his tone. "Bobby Corcoran," Mrs. O'Rourke said. She was dressed in morning black, and she carried the smell of beer and cigarettes into the bakery with her. She ran the fingers of her free hand through her thinning hair, as if straightening herself out in the presence of a man. "It was you I came here looking for," she said. I heard you were working behind the counter. That I am, Cork said. He started to offer his condolences, but didn't get past the mention of Kelly's name before the old woman interrupted him. I never had a daughter, she said. No daughter of mine would bed a murdering wop like Luca Brazzi, filthy guinea bastard. Cork said, I understand how you must feel, Mrs. O'Rourke. Do you? She said, and her face twisted with disgust as she clasped the brown paper bag to her chest and took a couple of unsteady steps toward the counter. Sean tells me I had a big falling out with your friend Sonny Corleone. Is that the truth? It is, Cork said, and he countered his repugnance at the approach of the old lady by leaning over the display case and offering her a slight smile. We don't see eye to eye anymore. That's good, Mrs. O'Rourke said, and she clutched the brown paper bag tighter to her chest. She looked like she was torn between speaking and remaining silent. Is there something I can do for you this morning? Cork asked. That's good, Mrs. O'Rourke repeated, as if Cork hadn't said a word. She took another step toward the display case and then leaned toward Cork. Though he was still several feet away, she looked as though she were talking to him face to face. Cork watched the door as if the meaning of the old lady's words might suddenly appear in the shafts of sun coming through the fanlight. He'd seen a story in the morning paper about a parade. In the back room, he found the New York American open to the comics, and he flipped through the pages until he found the story, which was a single column on page 3. A parade was scheduled for Manhattan in the afternoon along Broadway, something about civic responsibility. It looked like some political foolishness to Cork, and he couldn't imagine what Sonny and his family would have to do with it. He tossed the paper down and went back to straightening out the display cases, but his thoughts were stuck on Mrs. O'Rourke saying, God loves a parade, and Sonny will get his. And after a minute or two of fiddling with the pastries, he flipped the close sign on the front door, turned the lock, and hurried up the back stairs. He found Eileen in the living room stretched out on the sofa, holding a giggling Caitlin over her head. The child had her arms spread like wings and was pretending to fly. Who's minding the shop? Eileen said at the sight of him. Uncle Bobby, Caitlin squealed. Look, I'm flying like a bird. Bobby picked up Caitlin, threw her over his shoulder, and spun her around once before putting her down and patting her butt. Go play with your toys a minute, sweetheart, he said. I need to talk some grown-up things with your mom. Caitlin looked to her mom. When Eileen pointed to the doorway, she pouted dramatically, then put her hands on her hips and went off to her room in a playful pretense of indignation. Did you at least lock the door? Eileen said, pulling herself upright on the couch. And put up the close sign, Bobby said. It'll be slow until lunch anyway. He took a seat beside Eileen on the couch and explained what had just gone on with Mrs. O'Rourke. She was probably drunk and raving like a lunatic, Eileen said. What time is the parade supposed to start? Cork looked at his wristwatch. In about an hour. So? Eileen said. She paused, took another second to think things over. Go find Sonny and tell him what happened. He probably won't know a thing about any of it, and that'll be that. And I'll feel like an idiot. You're a pair of idiots, the two of you, Eileen said. She yanked Bobby to her and kissed him on the side of his head. Go find Sonny and talk to him. It's time you two buried the hatchet. What about Caitlin? Will you be okay running the shop? Eileen rolled her eyes. Now you're indispensable, are you? She got to her feet, squeezing Bobby's knee in the process. Don't take too long, she said, on her way to the bedrooms. In the doorway, she turned and waved him toward the kitchen and out the door. Go on, she said, and went off to get Caitlin. Vito handed Fredo a handkerchief. They were on 6th Avenue between 32nd and 33rd Street, waiting with hundreds of others for the start of the parade. Fredo had gotten out of bed coughing, but insisted on joining the rest of the family for the parade, and now Carmela was standing behind him, holding the palm of her hand over his forehead and frowning at Vito. The day was intermittently cloudy and sunny and promised to warm up, but at that moment, in the shadow of Gimbel's department store, it was chilly and Fredo was shivering. Vito held Connie by the hand as he looked over Fredo. Behind Carmela, Santino and Tom pretend boxed with Michael, who was excited about the parade and played along, slipping punches in under Sonny's arms and throwing his shoulder into Tom's gut. At the other end of the street, Councilman Fisher was surrounded by a dozen big shots, including the chief of police, all dressed up in his starched uniform with ribbons and medals pinned to his chest. Vito and his family had walked right by the group without so much as a nod from the councilman. "You're sick," Vito said to Fredo. "You're shivering." "No, I'm not," Fredo said. He peeled his mother's hand off his forehead. "I just got a little chill, that's all, Pop." Vito raised his finger to Fredo and called to Al Hatz, who was looking over the crowd with Richie Gatto and the Romero twins. On the other side of the block, Luca Brazzi and his boys were mingling with the crowd. When Al approached Vito with a cigarette dangling from his lips and his fedora tilted low on his forehead, Vito yanked the cigarette out of his mouth and stubbed it out with his toe. He straightened the fedora. "Take Fredo home," he said. "He's got a fever." "Sorry," Al said to Vito, meaning he was sorry for walking around with a cigarette dangling from his lips, looking like a caricature of a thug. He straightened out his tie, which was dark gray over a maroon shirt. To Fredo, he said, "Come on, kid. We'll stop at a soda fountain and get you a milkshake." "Yeah?" Fredo said, looking to his mother. "Sure," Carmela said. "It's good for your fever." "Hey, you guys," Fredo called to his brothers. "I gotta go 'cause I'm sick." The boys quit horsing around and joined Fredo and their parents. There were people all around them, many Italians, but Poles and Irish too, and a group of Hasidim in black robes and black fedoras. "Sorry you have to go," Michael said to Fredo. "You want me to get you the mayor's autograph if we see him?" "Why would I want that fat jerk's autograph?" Fredo said, and he shoved Michael. "Cut it out," Sonny said, and he grabbed Michael by the collar before he could shove Fredo back. Vito looked at his boys and sighed. He motioned to Hatz, who took Fredo by the arm and led him away. Michael said, "Sorry, Pop," and quickly added, "But do you think we'll see the mayor? You think I can get his autograph?" Vito lifted Connie to his chest and pulled her blue dress down over her knees. Cork pulled his Nash to the sidewalk in front of Sonny's building when he saw Hatz approaching the steps with a hand on Fredo's shoulder. Fat Bobby and Johnny LaSala, who had been standing at Sonny's door like a pair of sentries, started quickly down the steps, each with a hand in his jacket pocket. Cork slid across the seat and popped his head out the window. "Cork!" Fredo yelled and trotted over to the car. "Hey, Fredo," Cork said, and nodded to Hatz. On the stoop, the two sentries returned to their post. "I'm looking for Sonny," Cork said to Fredo. "He's not at his place, and I thought he might be with you guys." "Nah, he's at the parade," Fredo said. "I was just with him, but I'm sick, so I gotta come home." "Ah, too bad," Cork said. "He's at a parade. Sonny." "Yeah, everybody's there," Fredo said. "Except me now." "A parade?" Cork asked again. "What's the matter, Cork?" Hatz said. "You hard of hearing now?" "All the big shots are there," Fredo said. "Even the mayor." "No kiddin'." Cork pulled his cap off and scratched his head as if he was still finding it hard to believe that Sonny was at a parade. "So where is this parade?" he asked Fredo. Hatz pulled Fredo back from the car and said, "What are you asking so many questions for?" "'Cause I'm looking for Sonny," Cork said. "We'll look for him another time," Hatz said. "He's busy today." "They're by Gimbel's in the city," Fredo said. "The whole family's there. Sonny, Tom, everybody." When Hatz gave him a murderous look, Fredo yelled, "He's Sonny's best friend." Cork said to Fredo, "Take care of yourself, kid. You'll be feeling better in no time." He nodded to Hatz again and then slid back over to the driver's seat. In Manhattan, the cops had Herald Square blocked off with yellow barricades, though the streets were hardly lined with throngs of parade-goers. The pedestrian traffic looked like about what you'd expect for any day of the week, maybe a little heavier. Cork navigated around barricades and parked in the shadow of the Empire State Building. Before he got out of the car, he took a Smith & Wesson from the glove compartment and put it in his jacket pocket. On the street, he found a subway entrance and hustled out of the sunlight and into the chilly air of the tunnels, amid the rumbling clatter of trains. He'd been shopping before at Gimbel's with Eileen and Caitlin, and he figured he could navigate the tunnels that led directly into the store. Once underground, he didn't have any trouble finding his way. He followed the signs and the crowds into the bargain basement of the huge department store, where shopgirls worked a labyrinth of display cases and counters. From Gimbel's, he followed the signs until he was out on the street, and he made his way to 6th Avenue and then to Broadway, where a line of majorettes in white uniforms were twirling and tossing batons to the music of a marching band. Parade watchers lined up 2 and 3 deep along the curb, leaving plenty of room on the sidewalk for the ordinary foot traffic of the city. Cork squeezed his way out to the street in time to see Mayor LaGuardia waving to the crowd from atop a slow-moving flatbed truck. The mayor was surrounded by cops dressed up like generals and a crowd of officials in suits and uniforms, but his portly shape and the energetic way he waved his hat at the crowd made him unmistakable. A mob of police surrounded him and his contingent, and the parade stretched out in front of them as far as Cork could see along Broadway. Behind the mayor's truck, 2 cops on horseback followed like slow-moving place markers, separating the city officials from the majorettes and the marching band's clash of drums and cymbals and horns blaring the stars and stripes forever. Cork moved along the sidewalk in the opposite direction of the parade, past the marching band, looking for Sonny. Overhead, a line of gray clouds drifted past buildings, blocking the sun and creating a patchwork of light and shadow that seemed to move along the avenue as if following the procession. Once the marching band had passed, all that remained of the parade were clusters of people walking down the center of the street. One group of 12 men, women, and children carried a banner that read Walters Stationery, 1355 West Broadway. Beyond them, a well-dressed couple walked hand in hand, waving to the crowd. At the same moment that Cork spotted Luca Brasi on the other side of the street, Angelo Romero stepped in front of him, cutting him off. Cork backed up and then saw that it was his friend grinning at him. "What the hell are you doing here, Cork?" Angelo took him by the shoulders and gave him a shake. "Angelo," Cork said, "what's going on?" Angelo glanced at the street and then back to Cork. "It's a parade," he said. "What do you think?" "Thanks," Cork said. He grabbed Angelo's derby off his head and flicked at the red and white feather. "I've got an uncle from the old country wears a hat like this." Angelo snatched the hat back. "So what are you doing here?" he asked again. "I was shopping at Gimbel's," Cork said. "Eileen sent me. What are you doing here?" He gestured across the street. "And Luca? The Corleones are in the parade. We're looking out, making sure there's no trouble." "Where are they?" Cork said, scanning the street again. "I don't see them." "They're a couple of blocks back," Angelo said. "Come on, you want to come with us?" "Nah," Cork said. He spotted 2 of Luca's guys, Tony Coley and Poli Attardi, mingling with the crowd. Tony had a limp from where he'd been shot in the leg by Willie O'Rourke. "Do you have Luca's whole gang here?" Cork asked. "Yeah," Angelo said. "Luca and his boys, me and Vinny and Richie Gatto." "Where's Nico?" Cork asked. "No Greeks allowed." "You didn't hear about Nico?" Angelo said. "The Corleones got him a job on the docks." "Oh yeah," Cork said. "I forgot. Italians only in their crowd." "Nah, they ain't like that." And when he spotted a waste bin on the corner of 32nd, he started for it and then stopped abruptly at the sight of Pete Murray behind the wheel of a black Chrysler 4-door, with Rick Donnelly alongside him and Billy Donnelly in the back seat. The car was parked at the curb midway down the block. Instead of throwing out the newspaper, he opened it and held it out in front of his face as he backed into the entrance of a toy store. Pete and the Donnellys were wearing trench coats, and at the first sight of them, Old Lady O'Rourke's threat against Sonny and his family came back as clearly as if someone had just shouted it in his ear. "They've got a nice Irish surprise coming to them." Cork watched the car from the store entrance until the men stepped out onto the street, each of them with one arm thrust under his trench coat. He waited until he rounded the corner of 32nd and the Chrysler was out of sight before he broke into a run. 2 blocks later, he spotted Sonny and his family in the center of the avenue. Vito Corleone, with Connie in his arms between his wife and his son Michael, marched in front of Sonny and Tom, who were chatting with each other as if oblivious to everything going on around them. When Cork saw them, he bolted out into the street, but didn't manage more than a few steps before he ran into Luca Brasi and bounced off him as if he'd hit a wall. Luca met Cork's eyes and then jerked his head toward the street as Sean O'Rourke leapt over a yellow barricade screaming his name. "Luca Brazzi!" Sean was in the air, having leapt the barricade like a hurdler, a black pistol the size of a small cannon in his outstretched hand. His face twisted into ugliness, he hit the ground shooting, firing wildly. All around him, people scattered. Women grabbed their children and ran, screaming. Luca's men crouched and pulled guns from under their jackets as Sean stopped abruptly in the center of the street and aimed carefully at Luca. Brazzi couldn't have been more than 6 feet in front of Sean, and yet Sean stopped and held his gun with 2 hands and seemed to take a breath and let it out halfway, as if he was following instructions on how to aim and fire. When he squeezed off a shot, it hit Luca squarely in the chest, over his heart, and Luca's huge body flew back and fell like a downed tree. His head hit the center of a barricade and knocked it over before smacking into the edge of the slate curb. He jerked once and then was still. Sean watched Luca fall as he advanced on him, gun in hand, as if he were alone in a room with Luca and not in the middle of a parade. When the first bullet hit him in the chest, he spun around, surprised. He looked like he was waking from a dream, and then the next bullet hit him in the head, and the dream was over. He crumpled to the ground, the black monster of a gun falling out of his hand. Cork was still in the street near the curb when Sean fell, and after that, it started raining bullets and bodies. It was like a sudden downpour, getting caught in a sudden downpour of crackling gunfire and hysterical shouting and bodies hitting the ground like raindrops, a storm of movement and noise. Screaming parade watchers ran in every direction, some of them crawling on all fours, some of them slithering along the ground like snakes, all of them looking for the protection of doorways or storefronts. Cork bolted for cover, and no sooner had he made it into a doorway than the plate glass alongside him shattered, hit by the 4th of July fireworks of guns going off everywhere from every direction. Sean O'Rourke lay dead in the street, half his head blown away. Luca's men were crouched over him, guns out, shooting. Vito Corleone was sprawled over his wife, who held Connie and Michael in her arms, clutching them close to her. Vito was shouting something, his body spread over his family, his head up like a turtle. He seemed to be shouting to Sonny, who held Tom Hagen down by the back of the neck with one hand and wielded a gun with his free hand, shooting at someone. Cork scanned the sidewalk in the direction Sonny was firing and found a doorway with shattered window panes, and then Cor Gibson popped up with a gun in each hand, the pistols jerking with each shot, spitting bursts of white flame. Tony Coley got off a couple of shots at Gibson and then fell face forward, his pistol skittering over the street. It was almost quiet then for a heartbeat. The gunfire stopped and there was only the sound of men shouting to each other. Richie Gatto appeared on the street with a gun in each hand. He tossed one to Vito, who caught it at the same moment the calm ended and the shooting started again. Cork looked in the direction of the renewed gunfire and saw the Donnellys and Pete Murray charging along the street, 3 abreast, Pete Murray in the middle of the avenue with a Tommy gun, the Donnellys on either side of him with pistols. They advanced in a crouch behind a fusillade of fire, and Richie Gatto went down in front of Vito. Vito caught him in his arms, so that Richie's body shielded Vito and Vito's family behind them. Vito aimed carefully and squeezed off a shot, and Pete Murray went down, his chopper flying into the air out of his brawny arms, stray bullets shattering windows. Vito dropped to his knees in front of his wife and continued firing, squeezing off shots one at a time, so that it appeared he alone was moving with care and precision, while everything around him blazed and rattled. Sonny dragged Tom to Carmela, who managed to free a hand and pull him down to her. Tom wrapped his arms around. It seemed to Cork that the shooting couldn't go on much longer, not with sirens yowling and still more police cars arriving and blocking off the avenues. Sonny and his family appeared unscathed, and at the same moment that thought occurred to him, Cork saw Stevie Dwyer emerge from a doorway behind Sonny and Vito. With everyone's attention and the Donnellys and Gibson in front of them, Stevie walked unmolested into the street and toward Vito, gun in hand. Cork jumped out to the sidewalk and shouted to Sonny. He should have yelled, "Look behind you!" or "Stevie's behind you!" But instead, he shouted only Sonny's name. Sonny turned and spotted Cork, while at the same moment, Stevie lifted his gun and aimed for Vito. Cork was acutely aware of his vulnerability, standing as he was out in the open amid the staccato rattle of gunfire. He crouched slightly as if the constriction of his muscles and the slightly lowered posture might somehow protect him. Deep within him, something powerful was urging him to run and hide. But Stevie Dwyer was standing behind Vito, less than 2 car lengths behind him, his gun raised and aimed, about to shoot Sonny's father. And so Cork tore his gun from his pocket, aimed as best he could, and fired at Stevie an instant before Stevie fired at Vito. Cork's shot missed Stevie and hit Vito in the shoulder. When Cork realized what he had done, the gun fell from his hand and he staggered backward, as if he himself had just been shot. Vito dropped to the ground and Stevie's shot missed him altogether. Cork stumbled back to the storefront. Luca Brasi, arisen from the dead, fired at Stevie, hitting him in the head. And then again, it was like a downpour of movement and sound, gunfire everywhere again. Cork pressed against the brick wall, the Donnellys and Cor Gibson and the cops and everyone shooting at everyone. Amid the chaos of the moment, Cork's only thought was that he had to explain himself to Sonny, explain what had just happened, that he'd been aiming for Stevie and hit Vito by accident, but Sonny was lost in a crush of bodies attending to Vito. Cork shouted to Vinny and Angelo. He stuck his head out and waved for them to come to him. The twins cast quick glances toward him as they turned away from the Donnellys. They appeared to argue between themselves, and then Vinny jumped up and bolted for the sidewalk, and no sooner was he fully erect than a rattle of gunfire caught him in the neck and head, and pieces of his face exploded in a pink haze around him. He wavered on his feet, most of his face already gone, and then fell straight down, like a building imploding. Cork looked from Vinny to Angelo, who was looking at his brother with amazement. On the street behind him, Luca Brasi had picked up Vito and was carrying him to safety, while Vito reached out for his family, still huddled on the ground. Then everyone seemed to realize at once that the gunfire coming from the Donnellys and Gibson had stopped, and that the storefronts and doorways where they had been taking cover were empty. When they understood that they were escaping, Jojo, Vinny, and Paulie disappeared into the buildings, giving chase, and again a moment of calm descended on the street, where Richie Gatto, Tony Coley, and Vinny Romero lay dead, along with Pete Murray and Stevie Dwyer and Sean O'Rourke. As Cork looked over the dead, he saw that there were more bodies and that they had to be parade watchers, people who had taken a break from their work or their shopping, and who would never do either again. Among them, he spotted the body of a child, a dark-haired boy who looked to be about Caitlin's age. Somehow, everyone's attention seemed to fall on the child at the same instant. To Cork, it appeared that everyone was looking at the same small body sprawled out on the sidewalk, one tiny arm dangling over the curb. There was still much shouting, now mostly from the cops, who were swarming everywhere, but it seemed to Cork the street had suddenly gone silent. He stood in the doorway and looked behind him into what appeared to be a women's clothing store. A dozen